Hello and welcome back to Bayside Stories. Today's story is two parts of Bone. It's a bit of a kind of gruesome or gory story. I personally really like it. It's a fun way to introduce darkness, like the darker side of things, whether it is through need or just pure ignorance. It's a fun way to introduce a dark undertone to a world that is oftentimes overlooked when it comes to that side of it. I will say I did have issues pronouncing some of the names, as there are some Frisian names, and I do not speak Frisian because there's only about 150,000 people in the whole world that actually do. For those that don't know, it's a Western Germanic language. It's a very small area of the world that speaks it. So to any of you that speak it, sorry for the bastardization of your beautiful language and the names. Other than that, there are some tricky Spanish names in there, but it's nothing too serious. There is one person named Gorkith, however they misspell his name a few times and add an L in there, but because it's Gorkith without the L more often, I'll just be saying that. But thank you for listening, I hope you enjoy. There's a few locations where you can find both the books together. Those are Raven Rock Temple, Raven Rock Bulwark Jail, the Bulwark itself, the Raven Rock Morvain Manor, and Glover Mallory's house. I hope you enjoy, and I can't wait to hear your responses and comments about the books. Thank you. Bone, Part 1, by Tavi Dromio. "It seems to me," said Gares, thoughtfully looking into the depths of his flint, "that all great ideas come from pure happenstance. Take, for instance, the story I told you last night about my cousin. If he hadn't fallen off that horse, he never would have become one of the Emperor's foremost alchemists. It was late one Midas night at the King's Ham, and the regulars were always especially inclined towards philosophy." "I disagree," replied Siamora, firmly but politely. "Great ideas and inventions are more often found slowly over time by diligence and hard work. If you recall my tale from last month, the young lady, who I assure you is based on a real person, only recognized her one true love after she slept with practically everyone in North Point." "I put it to you that neither is the case," said Helgard, pouring a topper on his mug of grief. "The greatest inventions are created by extraordinary need. Must I remind you of the story I told you some time ago about Arslek Owen and the invention of bone mold?" "The problem with your theory is that your example is entirely fictional," sniffed Siamora. "I don't believe I remember the story of Arslek Owen and the invention of bone mold," frowned Gares. "Are you sure you told us?" "Well, this happened many years ago, when Vardenfall was a beauteous green land, when Dunmer Rukeimer and Dwemer and Nords lived together in relative peace, when they weren't trying to kill one another." Helgard relaxed into his chair, warming to his theme. "When the sun and moons all hung in the skies together." "Lord, Mother, and Wizard," grumbled Siamora. "If I'm going to be forced to hear your ridiculous story again, pray don't embellish and make it any longer than it has to be. This all happened in Vardenfell quite some time ago," said Helgard, ignoring Siamora's interruption with admirable restraint, "during an era of a king you would never have heard of. Arslek Owen was one of the king's noble and very disagreeable fellow. Because of his allegiance to the crown, the king had felt the need to grant him a castle and land, but he didn't necessarily want him as a neighbor, so the land he granted was far from civilization, right in an area of Vardenfell that is, even today, not quite civilized to this day. Arslek Owen built a walled stronghold and settled down with his unhappy slaves to enjoy a quiet, if somewhat grim, life. It was not long before his stronghold's integrity was tested. A tribe of cannibalistic Nords had been living in the valley for some time, mostly dining on one another, but occasionally foraging what they liked to call a dark meat, the Dunmer. Siamora laughed with appreciation. "Marvelous. I don't remember that from before. It's funny how you don't hear much about the Nords' rampant cannibalism nowadays." "This was obviously, as I have said, quite some time ago," said Helgard, glaring at part of his audience with civil malevolence. "And these were in many ways quite different times. These cannibalistic Nords began to attack Arslek Owen's slaves in the fields, and then slowly grew bolder, until they held the very stronghold itself under siege. They were quite a fearsome sight, you can imagine, a horde of wild-eyed men and women, with dagger-like teeth filed to tear flesh, wielding massive clubs, cloaked only in the skin of their victims. Arslek Owen assumed that if he ignored them, they'd go away. Unfortunately, the first thing the Nords did was to poison the stream that carried water into the walled stronghold. All the livestock and most of the slaves died very quickly before this was discovered. There was no hope of rescue, at least for several months, when the king's emissary would come reluctantly to visit this disagreeable vassal. The next closest source of water was on the other side of the hill, so Arslek Owen sent 3 of his slaves with empty jugs to bring some back. They were beaten with clubs and eaten before they were a few feet outside the stronghold gate. The next group he sent through, he gave sticks to defend themselves. They made it a few feet farther, but were also overwhelmed, beaten, and devoured. It was obvious that better personal defensive was required. Arslek Owen went to talk to his armorer, one of the few slaves with specific talents and duties. The slaves need armor if they're going to make it to the river and back, he said. Collect every scrap of steel and iron you can find, every hinge, knife, ring, cup, everything that isn't needed to keep the wall sturdy. Smelt it, and give me the most and the best armor you can, very, very quickly. The armorer, whose name was Gorkith, was used to Arslek Owen's demands, and knew that there could be no compromise on the quality and quantity of the armor, or the speed at which he worked. He labored for 30 hours without a break and recall, without any water to slake his thirst as he struggled with the kiln and anvil, until finally he had 6 suits of mixed metal armor. 6 slaves were chosen, clad in the armor, and sent with the jars to collect river water. At first, the mission progressed well. The Nords attacked the armored slaves with their clubs, but they continued their march forward, warding off the blows. Gradually, however, the slaves seemed to be walking uncertainly, dazed by the endless barrage. Eventually, one by one, they fell. The armor was peeled off their bodies, and they were eaten. The slaves could not move quickly enough in the heavy armor you made, said Arslek Owen to Gorkith. I need you to collect all the cadavers of the poisoned livestock, strip their skin, and give me the most and best leather armor you can, very, very quickly. Gorkith did as he was told, though it was a particularly repulsive task given the rancid state of the livestock. Normally, it takes quite a time to treat and cure leather, so I understand, but Gorkith worked at it tirelessly, and in half a day he had 12 suits of leather armor. 12 slaves were chosen, clad in the armor, and sent with jars to collect river water. They progressed at first much better than the earlier expedition. 2 fell almost immediately, but the others had some luck outmaneuvering their assailants while deflecting an occasional blow of the club. Several got to the river. 3 were able to fill up their jars, and 1 fellow very nearly made it back to the stronghold gates. Alas, he fell and was eaten. The Nords possessed a remarkably healthy appetite. What we need before I completely run out of slaves, said Arslek Owen thoughtfully to Gorkith, is an armor sturdier than leather, but lighter than metal. The armorer had already considered that, and taken stock of the materials available. He had thought about doing something with stone or wood, but there was practical problems with demolishing more of the stronghold. The next most prevalent stuff present in the stronghold was skinned dead bodies, hunks of muscle, fat, blood, and bone. For 6 hours he toiled relentlessly until he produced 8 suits of bone mold, the first ones ever created. Arslek Owen was somewhat dubious at the sight and smell, but he was very thirsty and willing to sacrifice another 18 slaves if necessary. Might I suggest, Gorkith inquired tremulously, having the slaves practice moving about in the armor here in the courtyard before sending them out to face the Nords. Arslek Owen coolly allowed it, and for a few hours, the slaves wandered about the stronghold courtyard in their suits of bone mold. They grew used to the give of the joints, the rigidity of the backplate, the weight pushed onto their shoulders and hips. They discovered how to plant their feet slightly askew to keep their balance steady, how to quickly turn, pivot without falling down, how to break into a run and stop quickly. By the time they were sent out of the castle gate, they were easily, very nearly, almost amateurs in the use of their medium-weight armor. 17 of them were killed and eaten, but 1 made it back with a jar of water. It's perfect nonsense, said Ziamara, but my point is still valid even so. Like all great inventors, even in fiction, the armorer worked diligently to create the bone mold. I think there is a good deal of happenstance as well, frowned Gares, but it is an appalling story I wish you hadn't told me. If you think that's appalling, grinned Helgrid, you should hear what happened next. And lucky for you fine folks watching this, I have part 2, so you do not have to wait. What do you mean the story gets more appalling? Gares was incredulous. How in Behithia's name could it get more appalling? It's a ruse, Ziamora scoffed, ordering 2 more mugs of grief and a glass of Flynn for Gares. How much worse can a tale get which prominently features cannibalism, abuse of slaves, and the regular placement of rotten animal carcasses? Don't you dare me, growled Helgrid, annoyed by his listener's lack of appreciation of his prose styling. Remind me, where were we? Arslick Owen is the owner of a stronghold, under siege by savage, cannibalistic Nords, said Siamora, keeping a straight face. After a lot of deaths and several unsuccessful attempts to get water, he had his armor with the unlikely name of Gorkith outfit his slaves with the first ever bone mold armor. One of them finally made it back with some water. It was only one jar full of water, said Helgrid, pulling back in his chair and continuing the tale. And Arslick Owen drank most of it, passing the remains to his dear armorer, Gorkith, and the last dribbles to a few dozen slaves who still lived. It was hardly enough to sustain health and well-being. Another expedition was necessary, but they had only one suit of bone mold left, as there's only one survivor of the trip. 1 out of 18 slaves made it through the gauntlet of Nords wearing that marvelous bone mold armor of yours, said Arslick Owen to Gorgith, and one can only carry back enough water for one. Therefore, mathematically, as we have, counting you and me, 56 remaining people at the stronghold. We need armor for 54. Since we already have 1, we only have to make 53 to make the total. That way 3 will make it back with enough water for you and me, and whoever's in the best condition to partake. I don't know what we'll do after that, but if we wait, we won't have enough slaves to fetch even a couple days worth of water. I understand, whimpered Gorgith, but how am I going to make the armor? I used all the livestock bones to make the first batch of bone mold. Arslick Owen gave an order, which Gorgith fearfully complied with, in 18 hours. What do you mean Arslick Owen gave an order, which Gorgith fearfully complied with, said Siamora. What was the order? All will be clear, smiled Helgrid. I have to choose what to reveal and what to conceal. Such is the way of the tale-teller. In 18 hours, Gorgith had 53 suits of bone mail, said Helgrid, continuing, not really minding the interruption, prepared for the slaves. Without prompting, he ordered the slaves to practice using the armor, and even allowed them more training than their predecessors. They not only learned how to move and stop quickly in bone mold, but how to adjust the peripheral vision, to see a blow before it came, and to sway to dodge, and where the sturdiest reinforcement points on the armor were, the center of the chest and the abdomen, and how to position themselves to take blows there, against their natural instincts. The slaves even had time for a mock battle before being sent out among the cannibals. The slaves handled themselves admirably. Very few, just 15 slaves, were killed and eaten outright. Only 10 were killed and eaten when they reached the river. That is when things did not go according to Arslick Owen's plan. 21 slaves with jars of water took off for the hills. Only 8 returned to the castle, largely because they were blocked by the cannibal Nords. It was a larger percentage than he had anticipated surviving, and Arslick Owen felt righteous indignation at the paucity of loyalty. Are you absolutely certain you wouldn't rather flee? He hollered from the battlements. Finally, he allowed the survivors in. 3 had been killed waiting for the gates to open. 2 more died almost upon stepping into the courtyard. 1 was delirious, walking around in circles, laughing and dancing before suddenly collapsing. That meant 5 jars of water for 4 people. The 2 surviving slaves, Arslick Owen and Gorkith. As the lord of the manor, Arslick Owen took the extra jar, but he was democratic with the others. You're quite correct, friend Garez. This story is getting more and more appalling. Just wait, smiled Helgrid. The next morning, Helgrid continued, Arslick Owen awoke to a perfectly still and quiet stronghold. There was no murmuring in the corridors, no sound of hard labor in the courtyard. He dressed and surveyed the scene. It appeared that the fortress was utterly deserted. Arslick Owen walked down to the armorer's quarters, but the door was locked. Open up, said Arslick Owen patiently. We need to speak. 30 out of our 54 slaves successfully made it to the river and gathered water. Admittedly, some then fled, and a couple didn't survive because I needed to correct their fickleness. But mathematically, that's a 55% success rate. If you and I and the 2 remaining slaves made this next run to the river, we too should survive. Zillion and Gilo left last night with their armor, cried Gorkith through the door. Who are Zillion and Gilo? The 2 remaining slaves. They don't remain anymore. Well, that's vexing, said Arslick Owen. Still, we must continue on. Mathematically, I heard something last night, whimpered Gorkith in a funny voice. Like footsteps, only different, and they were moving through the walls. And there were voices too. They sounded strange, like they couldn't move their jaws very well. But I knew one. Arslick Owen sighed, humoring his poor armorer. And who was it? Ponic. And who was Ponic? One of the slaves that died when the Nords poisoned our water. One of the many, many slaves that died. And we made use of him. He was always a nice, uncomplaining fellow. That's why I noticed his voice above all the others. Gorkith began to sob. I understood what he was saying. Which was what? Said Arslek Owen with a sigh. Give me back my bones. Gorkith's voice shrieked. There was silence for a moment, and then more hysterical sobbing. I saw that coming, laughed Siamora. There was nothing more to be done with the armor for the time being, said Helgrid, a trifle annoyed at the regular interruptions. So, Arslek Owen stripped one of the dead slaves of his suit of bone mold and put it on, impressing himself with his natural comfortability with medium-weight armor. For hours he boxed, feinted, dodged, sprinted, skipped, jumped, and generally coverted himself. When he felt tired, he returned to the shed and took a nap. The sound of the king's trumpet woke him with a start. Night had fallen, and for a moment he had thought he had been dreaming. Then the alarm sounded again, far in the distance, but clear. Arslek Owen leapt to his feet and ran to the rampart. Several miles away he could see the emissary and their vast and well-armored escort approach. They were there early. The cannibal Nords below looked at one another with consternation. Savages they might be, but they knew when a superior force was approaching. Arslek Owen joyously dashed down the stairs to Gorkith's chamber. The door was still locked. He beat on it, cajoling, demanding, threatening. Finally, he found a key, one of the few scraps of metal that hadn't been smelted days before. Gorkith appeared to be sleeping, but as Arslek Owen approached, he noticed the armorer's mouth and eyes were wide open, and his arms were folded unnaturally behind his back. On closer inspection, the armorer was obviously dead. What was more, his face and whole body were sunken, like an empty pig's bladder. Something moved through the walls, like a footfall, only squishy. Arslek Owen expertly and gracefully turned to face it, completely in balance. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a bubble expanding through one of the cracks in the stone. As more of the flesh-colored gelatinous matter emerged, it more clearly resembled part of a face. A flaccid, almost shapeless face, with a low brow and a slack, toothless jaw. The rest of the body oozed out of the crack, a soft bag of muscle and blood. Behind Arslek Owen, and to the side, there was more movement, more slaves welling up through the cracks of the stone. They were all around him, reaching out. Give us, moaned Ponic, his tongue rolling about his hanging jaw. Give us back our bones. Arslek Owen ripped off his bone mold, throwing it to the floor. 100 figures, more, pooled into the small chamber. That's not enough. The cannibals had cleared away by the time the king's emissary arrived at Arslek Owen's gate. They had not been looking forward to the visit. It was best, they thought philosophically, begin with the worst of the king's noblemen, so to end their trip well. They sounded the alarm once again, but the gates did not open. There was no sound from Arslek Owen's stronghold. It took a few hours to gain access. If the emissary had not brought in a professional acrobat with them for entertainment, it might have taken longer. The place seemed to be abandoned. They searched every room, until finally they came to the armorer's. There, they found the master of the manor, folded neatly, legs behind his head, arms behind his legs, like a fine gown, not a bone in his body. The first part of your story was complete nonsense, cried Ziamora. But now, it doesn't hold true on any level. How could bone mold be made again if the armorer who invented it died before he could tell anyone how he did it? I said that this was the first time it was created, not the first time people learned the craft. And when did someone first teach someone else the craft? Asked Garez. That, my friend, replied Hallgrid with a sinister smile, is a tale for another night.